Hi, thanks for joining this webinar on CLT board and membership structures. So the purpose of this webinar is to give you a background on CLT governance structure, specifically board and membership, so that you can make informed decisions about how your CLT will be governed. And this information is directed at early stage CLTs or groups that are considering starting a CLT, but there's information that should be useful for later stage groups as well. I also want to flag that we're going to be covering board recruitment, retention, and other kind of board capacity building topics in a later webinar. So this is really focused on deciding what that board and membership will look like in kind of broad strokes. So I'm going to start with some background, get into the basics of nonprofit governance, and discuss what a tripartite governance structure is and what it intends to accomplish. Then I'll get into some variations on the classic tripartite governance structure, some considerations when determining your governance structure, and some examples. So starting with the background, this is kind of an organizational chart of a nonprofit. So the membership is at the top. It's really important. The membership elects the board. The board is then responsible for hiring senior management, and senior management is responsible for hiring other employees, and together the staff manages operations. I'll go into more detail on what your bylaws need to include in the next webinar, but a big portion of it is about who can be a member, how your membership meets, who can be a board member, how they're elected, and how they do business. So basically the key elements of this organizational chart. And these things are more or less the same regardless of what province you're in, or if you incorporate federally, but there's some variation. So people sometimes think of being on a board as being just like any other volunteer role, but it's really a completely unique responsibility. Board members are volunteers, but they also have a whole kind of serious legal relationship to the organization and its beneficiaries that is really worth reminding ourselves of, even if you kind of more or less know what a board is. Board members are fiduciaries of the nonprofit. And what that means is that they have a legal duty to act primarily for the organization's benefit. And I like this quote from CPA Canada's Guide to Nonprofit Governance, because I think it's really important for CLTs. Why are directors in a fiduciary relationship? Because of the position they occupy within the organization. The assets belong to the organization, and the assets can only be managed through its directors. The whole idea of a CLT is that land is held in trust, in perpetuity, for the community and by the community. So it's really important that we take seriously who is managing those assets. So directors have a duty of care and a duty of loyalty. The duty of care means that they have a duty to be competent, to be informed, to act with diligence. That doesn't mean that they're experts on everything that comes to the board, but it means that they act in accordance with a particular standard of care. And then they have a duty of loyalty that requires them to act honestly and in good faith in the best interests of the organization. They can't delegate this duty, and they can't profit from their office. They really need to avoid conflicts of interest and also maintain confidentiality, which I'll get into more later. So these duties mean that you are taking on risks as a director. There's some risk of personal liability, meaning that if the organization is sued, takes on losses, or otherwise fails to respect the law, you could be personally liable. But you can protect yourself first by ensuring you carry out your duties, but second through directors and officers liability insurance, which is really important for every nonprofit. So then there's the membership. The membership is a pretty kind of broad. So what is a membership? A member of a nonprofit corporation is a person, including a corporation, who supports or benefits from the goals and objectives of the corporation. So essentially, a member is someone who supports your organization's mission and has some kind of rights and responsibilities under your organization's bylaws. That will typically include things like attending and voting in members' meetings, voting for, electing the board of directors, approving bylaws, including any amendments to bylaws, and there are other things like removing a director or, approving other important decisions. Generally, members don't have personal liability related to the nonprofit's actions, but they may have rights that enable them to ensure the board is acting in the corporation's best interests. There's a lot of flexibility in how your membership can be structured, as we'll discuss. But basically, you need to have a membership, but it doesn't have to be a broad and open membership legally. You just have to have at least one voting class of members. So people always talk about CLTs having a tripartite board and an open membership. But what exactly does that mean, and why has this become a core aspect of the CLT model? I think it's useful to interrogate this a bit because we don't want to be prescriptive about exactly how you run your CLT. You need to understand the ideas that are underpinning this structure, and then you can potentially find alternative ways of fulfilling the kind of general goals of the CLT model. So basically you shouldn't implement a tripartite board structure just because that's what CLTs do. You should be interested in creating a CLT in part because of the type of governance model that they tend to use, right? So in this structure, as we see in this diagram, members are those who typically live on CLT-owned land or directly use it, as well as those who live in the CLT's broader service area. There might be another class of membership too. And then the members elect the board, which is composed of 3 groups, each of which has been allocated a third of the seats in the organization's bylaws. Again, this is just kind of the classic structure. It's not always what happens. So to get into the tripartite structure a bit more, tripartite refers to there being 3 parties, so basically 3 categories, often of membership and also of the board. A tripartite board is a specific form of multi-stakeholder board, which is kind of a broader category of how you can structure a board. That means that different seats are allocated to ensure representation from different stakeholders. I really like this quote from John Davis, who's a major figure in the CLT movement in the States. Control of the CLT's board is diffused and balanced to ensure that all interests are heard, but that no interest is predominant. So let's talk about this a little bit more. One of the 3 groups in the classic tripartite structure is core representatives or core members. They represent the interests of people who lease land from the CLT or otherwise directly use it. So in the CLT model in the States, where CLT homes are often shared equity homeownership units, these tend to be leaseholders. But if the CLT has land that's used for rental, they could be renters. They could also be commercial tenants, those who do use a community garden, those who farm on CLT-owned land, things like that. People who are directly using that land. And there are a number of different kind of names for it. So the idea behind this is that people who actively use this land the CLT owns have an interest in how it's maintained, and they also have unique insight into it. But the idea is that if they formed a majority of the board, there could be a risk of decisions being made that benefit those core members to the detriment of the broader community. For example, by selling off assets to current residents. There are other ways to protect from this, of course, but that's kind of one of the reasons that there are other categories of membership as well. And core representatives are often elected by the core membership, though not always. I'm using the word representative here. The presumption is that each category of directors represents, to an extent, the interests of that group. So another category is community representatives. They are people who live or work in the organization's service area, which could be a neighborhood, a city, a county, an island, or it could be constituted a bit differently. It could be not based on geographic boundaries, but based on people with a historic connection or other sorts of ties to a given area, or it could also be classified as with additional requirements, like it has to be people who fall below a certain income level, which is what's often used for community housing development organizations in the US, some of which are CLTs. So these are people who have some knowledge of the community and its needs, and may have an interest in protecting and expanding the CLT and its land holdings. Other names for this group could be, residents, as in broader community residents, general members, directors at large, neighborhood representatives. And they often are elected, the board community representatives are often elected by the whole membership or just by community members or community members and core members, as we'll see in one of the examples. We've got public representatives. So these could be public officials, local funders, representatives of local nonprofits. or others who are presumed to speak for the public interest. This is a way of bringing in specific expertise, but also useful kind of strategic connections that might help the CLT. And it helps balance out different interest groups on the board. There may be specific provisions for these representatives. They could be appointed by their respective organizations. The board could have, for example, 4 organizational members, and each one appoints one representative to the board annually. They're kind of different ways of doing that. Sometimes these are called expert representatives or something like that. I don't love that because it kind of implies that the other kind of people on the board are not experts. So, you can also call them public representatives, organizational representatives, other things like that. So I want to get into an example that really does illustrate the tripartite model. And this is one in the Canadian context. Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust has 3 categories of membership, all of which are voting members. And the categories are essentially what I've just described. So you've got the core members who are tenants, service users, clients of service, community members who live or work within the boundaries of the land trust, and then organizational members who are representatives of specific local organizations. All member categories can vote on all allocated board categories, except for the fact that core members are the only ones who can vote for core members on the board, as you can see here with the yellow lines. They also have a system by which members within each of their separate projects, so different properties, nominate members to represent them on the board in a relatively proportionate way, which helps account for the different sizes, needs, and capacity of service users across their different projects, since they have a 15-unit rooming house, as well as a community garden, as well as an 82 property portfolio of mostly single-family homes. Their organizational members, those are kind of nonprofits and other local groups, are supposed to nominate a representative from within their organization to stand for election, but the final ratification or vote is taken by the general membership. So that is a bit about the kind of classic tripartite governance model, but I'm going to get into some variations on how your CLT might be able to structure its governance to reflect and respond to the needs of your particular community. So these are some questions to help you decide, on what basis you should be making governance decisions. And those questions include, what need is your CLT responding to and who's experiencing that need? Who has deep knowledge of your community? What are your guiding principles? We talk about this a bit more in another webinar. And what governance structures are compatible with your vision, with your values? How will your CLT grow, be protected in the future, adapt to change? How do existing groups and communities in your area govern themselves? And are there any kind of lessons you can take from those governance processes? And are you prioritizing efficiency or accountability or community control? These are things that you might have to balance out in your governance structure to ensure that your CLT can both act efficiently, be effective in accomplishing its goals, but also take the time to do the important kind of broader engagement that community-based governance typically requires. And here are some other kind of key questions and decisions on a more kind of tangible level. So when thinking about your membership, you want to think about who can become a member. Will there be multiple classes? How many? Based on what criteria? So like I mentioned, it could be things like, identity-based. It could be based on where you live or work. It could be based on your particular relationship with the CLT. There are so many different ways you can constitute that, and you can give different rights to different membership classes. So think about who will have the ability to vote, which classes, and what rights exactly will they have, and how will you ensure that your membership is representative of your community. And then with your board of directors, you want to think about how many board seats you'll have. Are they going to be allocated to specific groups? What will the nomination and election process be? How will you fill core member seats if you have them until your CLT actually has land or units that people will be living on or directly using? How long will board terms be? Will they be renewable? And how, again, will you ensure that your board is representative of your community? So now to share a few examples of how other groups, other CLTs in Canada, have adapted the tripartite model to suit their community's needs. And these are all going to be examples of other forms of multi-stakeholder boards and kind of variations on an open membership. So first, Gabriola Island Land Steward Society. They're on a small island near Victoria in BC. They have two categories of membership. So first, individual members who need to be permanent or part-time residents of the island. It was necessary for them to make this broader because many people have strong connections to the island but only live there part-time. And also the permanent population is so small. So it's kind of a practical decision there. They also extend individual membership to any member of the local First Nation because the First Nation has decided that those people have a connection to the land regardless of specific residency requirements, and they want to be able to recognize that. The other category of membership is organizational members, and they represent organizations that operate on the island. They also explicitly name the First Nation as an organizational member. So their board allocation is a bit complex. They have up to 5 directors at large, elected by and from the individual membership. The organizational member reps are appointed by their respective organizations, and they also have 2 spots open for First Nation representatives, which would be appointed by the process deemed fit by the local First Nation. And together, the organizational members and the First Nation representatives need to form a minimum of 50% of the board. Another example is Kensington Market CLT. They kind of look like they're tripartite at first because they have, 3 membership categories, 3 board categories, but they have something a little bit different. So they have the regular core membership, which is resident members, and then community membership called, again, community member and community membership. The community class is also open to those who work in the market, so not just those who live there. They also have a supporter membership category, and these people are non-voting. So it's anyone who kind of agrees with the mission of KMCLT. Only resident and community members can run for the board and can vote. They don't specifically allocate all of their board seats, but the bylaws do specify a minimum of 2 resident and 2 community members to ensure a minimum level of representation from both. And I want to note that this rule of 2 is a good one to keep in mind, and we saw it with Gabriola Island too. Having just one person on the board represent a specific community or interest is not necessarily ideal because it can be hard for them to feel supported if they're the only voice at the table. So having 2 people from any given group is kind of a good thing to keep in mind. And sticking with Toronto examples and shifting just slightly to the east, there's Toronto Chinatown Land Trust, and they have a unique governance model. They're fairly new, but I think it's still kind of worth highlighting them because they've set up their board and membership to reflect and represent those with an interest in Chinatown and its cultural heritage. So they have tenant members. They don't have any tenants yet, but when they do, the tenant members will elect at least 2 tenants to the board. Then they have community members, and this is defined as anyone who lives or works within the GTA who has a personal interest in Chinatown. So they're kind of leaving that open to reflect the broader group who have ties to that area. And then they, again, have supporter members who are non-voting. The majority of the board is kind of unallocated and would be elected by and from the community membership, as well as tenant members. So I want to talk a bit about decolonizing governance structures. I like this quote from Clint Cuzio, who's the Director of Indigenous Relations and Program Development at the Victoria Kool-Aid Society. He said this in the context of a session that he delivered. And the guiding question from this session was, how would you act as an organization if you didn't believe that you were on stolen land? Which is kind of a useful question to identify the behaviors and structures that you want to move away from. And he said that many people, out of fear of doing the wrong thing, do nothing. So, there's a bit of a void in terms of understanding how CLTs can and should, take decolonization seriously, engage with Indigenous groups. How do you engage in land-based practices on stolen land in a way that isn't just kind of reinstating or, supporting colonial structures? But there are some groups who are trying things out and seeing what works. One that's working on this right now, it's still in the early stage, but they're doing some interesting things, is the Downtown East Side Community Land Trust. So they're really looking at, what does it mean for them to move away from colonial governance structures? Their whole kind of model is critical of the institutionalized model of supportive housing, and they're working on incorporating trauma-informed approaches and shifting, the relationship to the land towards a healing one. And in support of all of this, they've developed something called a Tenant and Elders Committee. This is led by Indigenous elders, and they're using this as a space to kind of understand the direction that the CLT should be going in, and to really take on board the views and knowledge and wisdom of Indigenous elders, as well as the views of tenants in single-room occupancy hotels in their area. And I want to end by just mentioning some other forms of engagement beyond being on the board. As we discussed at the beginning of this session, being on the board of directors is one very particular and kind of intense way of contributing to a CLT, and it comes with significant responsibilities. It might not be of interest to or accessible to everyone. So there are other ways of engaging and contributing to a CLT, and you can set up as many other engagement or organizing structures as you want for your CLT. It can be beneficial that these structures, unlike the board or membership, aren't overly restricted by legislation. But this also means that these groups won't have any kind of legal power over the organization's decisions. They only have the power that the board chooses to give them. So they're kind of inherently advisory in nature, and you should really think about how you can ensure the organization respects their time and work. But, some examples are board committees. These are struck by the board and can make recommendations and support the board's work. Typically, it's a combination of board members and other volunteers who might advise on things related to finance, acquisitions, governance. You can have property-specific committees or forms of engagement. An example is Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust's tenant advisory committees. They created these for each of their distinct projects, where tenants can discuss operational issues, provide feedback on policies, and raise issues or suggestions to the board. Then you can do community-based research projects. I discussed this in another webinar, but this can be a way of getting a lot more people in your community involved in your work and bringing on board a lot of different views. You can create project-specific working or advisory groups, which is similar to the property-specific committees. And then there's also broad-based community organizing and community education, and related to that, advocacy projects. Thank you to everyone who helped inform this webinar. That's the end. Thank you so much for watching.